Hi, I'm Emma Collins. My brother Ryan once called me the family disappointment at Thanksgiving dinner while our mother nodded in agreement. He said I'd never amount to anything, that I was wasting my life teaching kids for pennies while he built an empire. What he didn't know was that 3 days later, a notary would call with news that would flip our entire family upside down. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who have the furthest to fall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October air in Cedar Falls carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter as I stood at my classroom window, watching the last of my third graders climb into their parents' cars. Madison Thompson waved enthusiastically from the backseat of her mom's SUV, her gap-toothed grin making me smile despite the exhaustion settling into my bones. It had been one of those days where everything felt harder than it should have, where the budget cuts showed in the outdated textbooks and the heating system that clicked and groaned like it was holding on by sheer willpower. I gathered the stack of math worksheets from my desk, the red ink corrections bleeding together in my tired vision. 26 papers, each one representing a small person trying their best to understand fractions and long division, each one deserving more than the 45 minutes I could spare between lessons. The weight of their trust sat heavy on my shoulders as I slipped the papers into my worn canvas bag, the same one I'd been carrying since my first year of teaching 8 years ago. The hallway echoed with the hollow sound of my footsteps as I made my way toward the exit, past bulletin boards covered in Halloween artwork and inspirational posters that proclaimed every child could achieve their dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days encouraging children to reach for the stars, while my own family saw my career as evidence of settling for less. Grace Martinez appeared at her classroom door as I passed, her dark hair escaping from the bun she'd twisted that morning, her teacher cardigan decorated with tiny pencils and apples. She was the kind of colleague who remembered your birthday and always had an extra granola bar when you forgot lunch. The kind of person who made the challenging days bearable just by existing in the same building. "Rough day?" she asked, reading the exhaustion in my posture with the accuracy that came from 7 years of working across the hall from each other. Tyler Morrison decided that today was the perfect day to test whether glue sticks are actually edible, I replied, managing a weary laugh. And apparently they are, according to his scientific analysis. Grace chuckled, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the parking lot. At least he's conducting experiments. That shows curiosity and hypothesis testing. Very advanced for 8 years old. This was what I loved about Grace. Her ability to find the silver lining in even the most chaotic classroom moments. Her genuine belief that every child's mistake was really just learning in disguise. She had the kind of optimism that hadn't been worn down by budget meetings and standardized testing. The kind of energy that reminded me why I'd chosen this profession in the first place. "Are you ready for the Collins family Thanksgiving extravaganza?" she asked as we reached my car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that had seen better decades but still got me from point A to point B with minimal complaint. I groaned, leaning against the driver's side door. As ready as anyone can be for their annual reminder of how they've disappointed everyone they've ever loved. Grace's expression softened with the kind of concern that only came from someone who'd heard this story too many times. "Emma, you know that's not true. Look what you do every day. Look at how those kids light up when they see you. Look at the thank you cards from parents whose children finally understand reading because of you." "Try explaining that to my mother," I said, fishing my keys from the bottom of my purse. According to her, I'm the 32-year-old spinster daughter who chose to play with finger paints instead of building a real career. And what exactly constitutes a real career in the Collins family dictionary? Real estate, apparently. Making 6 figures, driving a luxury car, living in a house that could fit my entire apartment in the foyer. I thought about Ryan's life. The carefully curated success story that our mother loved to recite at every opportunity. The beautiful wife, the perfect children, the country club membership, the vacation photos that looked like they belonged in a travel magazine. Grace shook her head, her teacher instincts recognizing injustice when she saw it. "You know what I think? I think they're intimidated by what you do. It takes a special kind of person to dedicate their life to shaping young minds. Not everyone has that calling. Special or crazy, depending on who you ask, I said, though Grace's words warmed something in my chest that had been cold for longer than I cared to admit. Both, probably, she said with a grin. The best teachers usually are. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, past the courthouse with its historic clock tower, and the diner that had been serving the same coffee and pie since 1952, I thought about Grace's words. This town had watched me grow up, had seen me graduate valedictorian from Cedar Falls High, had celebrated when I earned my teaching degree from Ohio State. But somehow, in my family's eyes, all of that had been overshadowed by Ryan's flashier achievements. My apartment sat above Murphy's Bakery on Main Street, accessible through a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. The scent of tomorrow's bread drifted up through the floorboards, mixing with the lavender candle I'd lit that morning in a futile attempt to make the small space feel more like home and less like a temporary stop on the way to somewhere better. The apartment itself was nothing special, a one-bedroom with thin walls and windows that rattled when the wind picked up, but it was mine. I'd painted the walls a soft sage green, hung curtains my grandmother had sewn before she passed, arranged my books in careful stacks on floating shelves I'd installed myself after watching 3 YouTube tutorials. It wasn't the suburban palace that Ryan and Ashley lived in, but it held the quiet contentment of a space shaped by someone who understood the difference between a house and a home. I set my canvas bag on the small dining table that doubled as my desk for grading papers and opened the refrigerator to survey my dinner options. A container of leftover soup from Sunday, some wilted lettuce that was optimistically past its prime, and a block of cheese that could probably feed me for the rest of the week if I was creative with it. This was the reality that my family never quite grasped, the careful budgeting that came with choosing a profession based on passion rather than profit. My phone buzzed against the counter, displaying my mother's contact photo, a picture from last Christmas where she was smiling but her eyes held that familiar expression of mild disappointment that seemed permanently etched there whenever she looked at me. "Hi, Mom," I answered, settling into the small armchair I'd bought secondhand and reupholstered with fabric that reminded me of my grandmother's garden. "Emma, sweetheart, I just wanted to confirm that you're still coming Thursday," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested she expected me to cancel, to prove once again that I was unreliable in ways that mattered. "Of course I'm coming. I already told you I'd bring the pumpkin pie." "Oh, that's right, your grandmother's recipe." There was a pause, the kind that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "You know, Ashley offered to pick up desserts from that new bakery downtown. They have those beautiful little individual tarts that look so professional." The implication hung in the air like smoke, the suggestion that my homemade pie made with the same recipe that had graced our Thanksgiving table for 3 generations somehow wasn't professional enough for this year's gathering. "I've already bought the ingredients, Mom. The pie will be fine." "Of course, dear. I just thought you might want to take a break from cooking this year. You work so hard during the week." This was how it always went, the subtle undermining disguised as concern, the way my contributions were simultaneously expected and dismissed. "It's not work when you enjoy it." "If you say so. Ryan and Ashley will be here around 2 with the children. You should try to arrive early so you can help me get everything ready." "What time do you want me there?" "Oh, 11 should be fine. That will give us time to catch up before everyone arrives." Everyone, as if Ryan and his family constituted a crowd rather than 3 additional people. As if my presence was somehow separate from everyone, a preliminary event before the main show began. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk of my small living room, looking at the framed photo on my bookshelf that showed my father and me at my college graduation. He stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders, his smile genuine and proud as I held my diploma in elementary education. He'd been the one person in my family who understood why I'd chosen teaching, who saw the value in the work even when the paycheck was modest. Tom Collins had been a substitute teacher himself before he'd gotten into real estate, back when Ryan and I were young and money was tighter than anyone wanted to remember. He used to tell me stories about the classrooms he'd visited, about the teachers who made differences in ways that couldn't be measured by test scores or salary figures. "The world needs people who care about more than profit margins, Emma," he'd said when I'd announced my major. "It needs people who understand that some things are worth more than money." He'd been gone for 2 years now, a sudden heart attack that took him before any of us were ready to say goodbye. In the chaos that followed, Ryan had stepped into the role of family protector and provider, handling the estate details and supporting our mother through her grief. I'd offered to help, but Ryan had waved me off with the kind of dismissive gesture that suggested legal and financial matters were beyond my simple teacher's understanding. The days following Dad's funeral had been a blur of casseroles from neighbors and legal meetings I wasn't invited to attend. Ryan had explained that he was handling everything, that I shouldn't worry about the complicated stuff, that my focus should be on taking care of Mom emotionally while he dealt with the practical matters. It had seemed reasonable at the time, a division of labor that played to our different strengths. Now, sitting in my small apartment with the sounds of the evening settling around me, I wondered if my father would have been proud of the woman I'd become, or disappointed that I'd let others define my worth for so long. The teaching award he'd won during his substitute days sat on my bookshelf, a small pewter apple engraved with his name, and the year he'd been recognized for his dedication to students. I'd kept it after he died, a reminder of the legacy that had shaped my own calling. Thursday morning arrived gray and bitter, the kind of November day that made you grateful for warm houses and hot coffee. I stood in my small kitchen before dawn, rolling out pie crust on the limited counter space, and breathing in the familiar scents of cinnamon and nutmeg. The pumpkin pie had been my grandmother's signature contribution to family gatherings, and after she passed, the responsibility had somehow fallen to me, the family member most likely to have time for such domestic endeavors. The recipe was written in her careful script on an index card that had survived decades of Thanksgiving mornings, stained with vanilla extract and worn soft at the edges from handling. Making the pie felt like a conversation with her memory, a way of keeping her present at a table where I increasingly felt like an outsider in my own family. By the time preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Finished baking and cleaning up, the morning had burned off into the kind of crisp autumn day that made Cedar Falls look like a postcard. I dressed carefully, choosing a burgundy sweater that brought out the auburn in my brown hair and dark jeans, that were nice enough for family dinner, but comfortable enough to survive several hours of subtle criticism. The drive to my childhood home took 12 minutes through neighborhoods, where every house held memories of growing up in a place where everyone knew your name and your business in equal measure. The house on Maple Street looked exactly the same as it had when I was 8 years old, a split-level ranch with brown brick and white shutters that my father had painted every few years with the dedication of a man who believed that taking care of things was how you showed love. Mom's car sat in the driveway next to Ryan's gleaming black BMW, the kind of vehicle that announced success before its owner even stepped out. I parked my modest Honda behind it, the contrast between our life choices evident even in our choice of transportation. The front door opened before I could knock, revealing my mother in the apron she only wore on special occasions, her silver hair styled in the same way she'd worn it for the past 15 years. Linda Collins had been beautiful once, the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. But grief and time had settled into the lines around her eyes, creating a permanent expression of weariness that seemed to deepen whenever she looked at me. "There you are," she said, accepting the pie I offered with the kind of smile that suggested she was already mentally comparing it to whatever professional alternative Ashley had probably suggested. Ryan and Ashley are in the living room with the children. They've been here since noon, helping me get everything ready. The implication was clear, that I was late despite arriving exactly when she'd asked me to, that my contribution was less valuable than whatever help Ryan and Ashley had provided in the hour before my arrival. I followed her into the house that smelled like turkey and disappointment, past the family photos that lined the hallway like a timeline of moments when I'd been present but somehow never central to the story being told. The living room buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that came with Ryan's family gatherings. Tyler, 8 years old and built like his father, was sprawled on the floor with a tablet, earbuds blocking out the adult conversation while he played some game that involved a lot of explosions. Madison, 6 and delicate like her mother, sat at the coffee table coloring in a book with the intense concentration that children brought to activities they considered important. Ashley looked up from the magazine she'd been reading, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite having 2 children and supposedly helping with dinner preparation. She wore the kind of outfit that managed to be both casual and expensive, the sort of thing that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year, but looked effortless in the way that only very deliberate choices could achieve. "Emma!" she exclaimed with the enthusiasm that wives of successful men learn to project when greeting their less fortunate relatives. "How are you, honey? How's the teaching going?" "It's going well," I replied, accepting her brief hug and breathing in the scent of her perfume, something floral and complex that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. "How are you two doing?" "Oh, we're wonderful. Ryan just closed the biggest sale of his career last week. A commercial property downtown that's going to be developed into luxury condos. The commission alone is more than most people make in a year." This was Ashley's way, the casual mention of financial success that was meant to sound like sharing news but felt more like establishing hierarchy. She had never been deliberately cruel, but her worldview was shaped by the belief that success was measured in dollars and square footage, that happiness could be quantified by the luxury of your lifestyle. Ryan emerged from the kitchen, carrying a blake beer, his presence filling the room in the way that successful men learn to occupy space. At 35, he still looked like the football captain he'd been in high school, broad-shouldered and confident, the kind of man who'd never questioned whether he deserved the good things that came his way. His smile when he saw me was genuine, but carried an undertone of condescension, the expression of someone greeting a child who was trying their best but would never quite measure up. "Hey sis," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and success. "How's life in the classroom? Still molding young minds and all that?" "Still teaching," I replied, stepping back and noticing how he'd managed to make my profession sound like a hobby rather than a career. "Congratulations on your big sale. Ashley was just telling me about it." "Thanks. It's been a good year for us, really good." He settled into his chair with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from never having to worry about money, never having to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. "Actually, we've been thinking about expanding the business, maybe bringing in a partner to handle some of the residential stuff while I focus on commercial development." "That sounds exciting," I said, because it was the response that was expected, because showing genuine interest in Ryan's success was part of the family script that I'd been reading from for 32 years. "It is, it really is. You know, there's good money in real estate if you're willing to work for it. I keep telling Ashley we should encourage more people to consider it as a career change. It's never too late to try something new." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, the implication that my current career was somehow temporary, that real estate was a more worthy pursuit than spending my days with children who still believed in magic and fairness. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with these conversations, the way my family's love seemed to be conditional on my willingness to admit that my choices had been mistakes. "I'm happy where I am," I said, my voice steady despite the anger beginning to simmer beneath my calm exterior. "Of course you are," Mom interjected from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Emma has always been content with simple things. She's never needed much to be happy." Content with simple things. Never needed much. The words hit like small cuts, the kind of casual cruelty that masqueraded as understanding, that reduced my deliberate choices to evidence of limited ambition rather than different values. Madison looked up from her coloring book, her 6-year-old eyes bright with curiosity. "Aunt Emma, do you like being a teacher?" "I love it," I told her, my voice warming as I knelt down to see her artwork. "I get to spend my days with kids who ask amazing questions and see the world in ways that surprise me every single day." "That sounds fun," she said, returning to her careful coloring with the kind of focus that reminded me why I'd chosen to work with children in the first place, their ability to see value in things that adults had learned to dismiss. "It is fun," I agreed, aware that the adults in the room were listening to this conversation with the kind of tolerant amusement reserved for discussions of childhood dreams, as if my career was something I'd eventually outgrow rather than a calling I'd deliberately chosen. The rest of the afternoon passed in the familiar rhythm of family gatherings, the careful dance of conversation that avoided topics that might lead to conflict, while somehow managing to convey disappointment through the topics that were chosen instead. Ryan talked about his business plans and his children's achievements in their expensive private school. Ashley discussed the renovations they were planning for their already perfect house. Mom shared updates about neighbors and their adult children who were doctors and lawyers and successful business owners. I listened and nodded and contributed when spoken to directly, but I felt increasingly like an observer rather than a participant, someone who was present but not really included in the family narrative being constructed around the dinner table. My contributions to the conversation were met with polite interest that felt more like tolerance, as if my perspective was something to be endured rather than valued. When we finally sat down to dinner, the formal dining room table set with the good china that only appeared on holidays, I found myself in the seat I'd occupied since childhood, positioned between my mother and Uncle Pete, who had driven down from Columbus and carried with him the faint scent of cigar smoke and the kind of straightforward honesty that had made him my father's favorite brother. The turkey was perfect, golden and moist, surrounded by the traditional sides that had graced our Thanksgiving table for as long as I could remember. Mom had outdone herself, as she always did on holidays, her need to prove her domestic competence intensifying when family gathered to judge her efforts. "This is beautiful, Linda," Ashley said, photographing her plate with the kind of casual documentation that turned every meal into social media content. "You should really consider catering. You have such a gift for this." "Oh, I'm too old to start a new career," Mom replied, but she glowed under the praise in a way that made me realize how hungry she was for recognition, how much she needed to feel valued for something beyond her role as Ryan's support system. "It's never too late," Ryan said, raising his wine glass in a mock toast. "Look at Emma. She could still change careers if she wanted to. Teaching doesn't exactly have a pension plan worth retiring on." The comment landed like a slap, the casual dismissal of my financial security disguised as concern for my future. I felt Uncle Pete shift beside me, his disapproval radiating like heat, but I forced myself to smile and take a sip of wine instead of responding with the anger that was building in my throat. "Actually, the state teacher's retirement system is quite good," I said, my voice level despite the tremor I could feel starting in my hands. "And I love what I do. That's worth more than money." "Is it though?" Ryan asked, leaning back in his chair with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from never having to choose between paying bills and following your passion. "I mean, that's a nice sentiment, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to take care of yourself. You need to think about your future." "Ryan," Ashley said softly, the warning tone that wives learn to use when their husbands were approaching the line between honesty and cruelty. "What?" "I'm just saying that Emma's smart enough to do anything she wants. She was always the brain in the family. It seems like a waste to spend all that intelligence on a job that barely pays the bills. A waste." The word hung in the air like smoke, settling into my lungs and making it hard to breathe. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, seeing Mom's expression of resigned agreement, Ashley's uncomfortable sympathy, Uncle Pete's growing anger, and the children's confused awareness that something unpleasant was happening in the adult conversation. "You know what's really a waste?" I said, my voice calm despite the fire burning in my chest. "A waste is spending your whole life chasing money instead of meaning. A waste is measuring your worth by your bank account instead of the difference you make in the world." "Oh, Emma," Mom sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment and familiar resignation. "You've always been so idealistic, but idealism doesn't pay for retirement or medical bills or any of the things you'll need when you're older." "Your mother's right," Ryan added, cutting into his turkey with the kind of precise movements that suggested controlled irritation. "I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm trying to look out for you. We all are. But you're 32 years old, living in an apartment above a bakery, driving a car that's older than some of your students. Don't you want more than that? More than that." As if my life was a consolation prize, a participation trophy for someone who hadn't tried hard enough to win the real game. I thought about my students, about the way Madison Thompson's face had lit up yesterday when she finally understood long division, about the thank you card from Tyler Morrison's parents that sat on my refrigerator, thanking me for believing in their son when he'd stopped believing in himself. "I have everything I want," I said, my voice steady even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "Really?" Ryan asked, his tone suggesting he found this hard to believe. "You don't want a nice house? A reliable car? The security that comes with a real income? You don't want a husband and children of your own? The last question hit like a physical blow. The implication that my life was incomplete because I hadn't followed the prescribed path of marriage and motherhood, that my love for other people's children somehow counted less than the biological imperative that drove other women's choices. What I want, I said, setting down my fork with more force than necessary, is to be valued for who I am instead of criticized for who I'm not. Nobody's criticizing you, Mom said quickly, her voice carrying the kind of panic that came when family dinners threatened to become family fights. We love you exactly as you are. We just want you to be happy. Happy like Ryan? I asked, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. Happy like Ashley? Happy like everyone who measures their worth by their net worth? There's nothing wrong with financial security, Ryan said, his voice rising slightly as his patience began to fray. There's nothing wrong with wanting nice things, or building something meaningful with your life. And there's nothing wrong with finding meaning in service instead of profit, I shot back, feeling Uncle Pete's approving nod from beside me. There's nothing wrong with choosing a career because you love it instead of because it pays well. Love doesn't pay the bills, Emma. Neither does misery, Ryan. And neither does spending your whole life chasing after things that don't actually make you happy. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, filled with all the things that had gone unsaid for years, all the times I'd swallowed my anger and accepted their judgment, because fighting seemed harder than enduring. Tyler and Madison had stopped eating, their young faces reflecting the tension that crackled between the adults like electricity before a storm. Uncle Pete cleared his throat, the sound deliberately loud in the quiet dining room. You know, Tom always said that Emma had more sense than the rest of us combined, said she understood what really mattered in life. Dad said a lot of things, Ryan replied, his voice tight with irritation that someone had introduced our father's memory into the conversation. But he also understood the importance of financial responsibility. He built a successful business. He provided for his family. He also spent 15 years as a substitute teacher before he went into real estate, Uncle Pete continued, his eyes steady on Ryan's face. And he never forgot the value of that work, even after he started making more money. He used to say that Emma reminded him of who he was, before he got caught up in trying to impress people who didn't matter. I felt tears threatening behind my eyes, the unexpected defense from someone who had known my father in ways that Ryan seemed to have forgotten. Tom Collins had been a complicated man, someone who had understood both the necessity of financial security and the importance of work that fed the soul rather than just the bank account. That's ancient history, Ryan said, dismissing Uncle Pete's words with a wave of his hand. We're talking about Emma's future, not Dad's past. Maybe Emma's future would be brighter if she had a family that supported her choices instead of constantly questioning them, Uncle Pete replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came with age and wisdom and the right to speak uncomfortable truths. We do support her, Mom said quickly, her voice high with defensive strain. We've always supported her. We just want what's best for her. What you want, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, is for me to be ashamed of who I am. What you want is for me to apologize for my choices and admit that you were right all along. That's not true, Ryan said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. Isn't it? I asked, looking around the table at faces that reflected varying degrees of discomfort and denial. When was the last time any of you asked about my work without suggesting I should be doing something else? When was the last time you celebrated something I accomplished, instead of comparing it to what I should have accomplished instead? The questions hung in the air unanswered, creating a space for truth that none of us seemed prepared to fill. I thought about all the times I'd tried to share my excitement about a breakthrough with a struggling student, only to have the conversation redirected to Ryan's latest sale or Ashley's latest purchase. I thought about all the times my accomplishments had been met with polite acknowledgement before being dismissed as evidence of my limited ambitions. You're being dramatic, Ryan said finally, his voice carrying the exhausted tone of someone who was tired of dealing with unreasonable people. Nobody expects you to apologize for anything. We just think you could do better if you tried. Better, I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. Better than spending my life with children who think I hung the moon? Better than work that makes me excited to get up every morning? Better than knowing that I'm making a difference in the world, even if it's one student at a time? Better than struggling to pay your bills every month? Mom said softly, her voice heavy with the kind of maternal concern that felt more like judgment. Better than worrying about your future. Better than being alone. Alone. The word hit harder than any of the others. The implication that my unmarried status was evidence of failure rather than choice. That my independence was something to be pitied rather than respected. I thought about the evenings I spent grading papers in my small apartment, the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, the way my students' parents trusted me with their most precious possessions every single day. I'm not alone, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I'm surrounded by people who value what I do. I have students who write me thank you notes. I have parents who cry when their children finally learn to read. I have colleagues who understand that not everything in life can be measured by a paycheck. That's all very nice, Ryan said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. But those people aren't going to take care of you when you're 65 and can't afford to retire. Those thank you notes aren't going to pay for health care or help you when you need it. And your money isn't going to matter when you're 65 and realize you spent your whole life doing work that never meant anything to anyone, I replied, the words coming out with more force than I'd intended. My work means something, Ryan said, his voice rising with defensive anger. I help people find homes, I create communities, I contribute to the local economy. You sell houses to people who already have more money than they know what to do with, I shot back, years of swallowed resentment finally finding its voice. You profit from other people's desire for status symbols. You've never even worked with first-time homebuyers because the commissions aren't big enough to bother with. That's enough, Mom said, her voice sharp with the kind of authority that had once been able to stop childhood fights but felt ineffective against adult grievances. This is Thanksgiving dinner, not a battlefield. But it was too late to restore the peace. Too late to pretend that the undercurrents of resentment and disappointment hadn't finally risen to the surface. The careful politeness that had characterized our family gatherings for years had cracked, revealing the fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface. You know what? Ryan said, setting down his napkin with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested a decision had been made. I'm tired of tiptoeing around this. Emma, you are the family disappointment. You always have been. You had every opportunity to make something of yourself, and instead you chose to waste your potential playing with children's toys and teaching kids who will probably forget your name before they graduate high school. The words landed like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Family disappointment. Waste your potential. The children who would forget my name. I felt something inside me break. Not with sadness, but with a kind of liberating anger that came from finally hearing the truth spoken aloud instead of implied, through careful suggestion. At least I chose a career that helps people instead of exploiting them, I said, my voice deadly calm. At least I sleep well at night knowing that my work makes the world a little bit better, instead of just making my bank account a little bit fatter. Girls, please, Ashley said, her voice carrying the kind of diplomatic strain that came from trying to mediate conflicts that were bigger than any peacemaking effort could contain. She's not a girl, Ryan said, his anger now fully unleashed. She's a 32-year-old woman who still acts like she's playing house instead of living in the real world. She's a woman who chose to spend her life babysitting other people's children instead of having any of her own. Ryan! Mom gasped, finally recognizing that the conversation had crossed into territory that couldn't be uncrossed. But I felt strangely calm, as if Ryan's cruelty had finally freed me from the obligation to pretend that his opinion mattered, that his approval was something worth seeking. I looked around the table at my family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. You're right, I said, my voice steady despite the tears that threatened at the corners of my eyes. I am different from all of you. I chose meaning over money. I chose service over status. I chose to spend my life building up other people instead of tearing them down. And if that makes me the family disappointment, then I'm proud to disappoint you. I stood up from the table, my movements deliberate and calm, gathering my purse and my dignity while my family sat in stunned silence. "Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was lovely, as always. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Thanksgiving." I walked out of the dining room, through the living room where family photos documented a lifetime of moments when I'd been present but never quite central, and out the front door into the crisp November air that felt like freedom after the suffocating atmosphere of family obligation. As I drove home through the darkening streets of Cedar Falls, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Relief at finally hearing the truth spoken aloud. Relief at no longer having to pretend that my family's love wasn't conditional on my willingness to apologize for who I was. Relief at realizing that I didn't need their approval to know my own worth. The weekend passed quietly, a blessed stretch of time without family obligations or expectations to fulfill. I spent Saturday grading papers and Sunday reading in my small apartment, letting the peace of solitude wash away the lingering sting of Thursday's confrontation. Grace called twice to check on me, her teacher instincts recognizing emotional distress even through the phone, but I assured her I was fine, and for the first time in years I actually meant it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that November sometimes offered. Bright sunshine cutting through the bare branches of the maple trees that lined Main Street. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of math worksheets when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Collins, this is Mr. Harrison from Harrison & Associates. I was your father's attorney. I wonder if you might have time to come in this morning. There are some matters regarding your father's estate that need to be discussed." The voice on the other end of the line carried the weight of age and careful formality that I remembered from the few times I'd met Mr. Harrison at church functions and town events. He had been my father's attorney for over 20 years. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who spoke in measured sentences that suggested every word had been considered before being spoken. "Of course," I said, glancing at the clock on my microwave. "I have about an hour before I need to be at school. Would that work?" "Actually, Miss Collins, this matter is quite important. I've already contacted the school to arrange for a substitute. I hope you don't mind, but Principal Watson assured me it could be handled." The unusual nature of his request sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the November morning. In all the years I'd known Mr. Harrison, he had never struck me as the type of man who made dramatic gestures or emergency appointments, unless something significant was at stake. "Is everything all right?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup, with hands that had suddenly become unsteady. "Everything is fine, Miss Collins. Better than fine, actually. But there are some documents that require your immediate attention, and I believe this conversation is best had in person. Can you be here by 9? I agreed, though my mind raced with possibilities, as I quickly dressed in something more professional than my usual school attire. The law offices of Harrison & Associates occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse and 2 streets over from the elementary school, where I should have been teaching fractions to my 3rd graders. The November air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves as I walked up the brick pathway to the familiar green door that had been painted the same shade for as long as I could remember. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Harrison's secretary for the past 30 years, greeted me with the kind of warm smile that suggested she knew something I didn't, something that pleased her immensely. "Emma, dear, you look lovely this morning. Mr. Harrison is waiting for you in his office. Can I get you some coffee? Tea?" "Coffee would be wonderful," I said, though my stomach was already tight with nervous energy that probably didn't need the addition of caffeine. Mr. Harrison's office reflected the careful attention to detail that had made him one of Cedar Falls' most respected attorneys. Dark wood furniture that had been polished to a warm glow, law books arranged with military precision, and family photos that spoke of a life lived with intention and care. He stood as I entered, extending his hand with the kind of formal courtesy that belonged to a different generation. "Emma, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, have a seat. I know this is unusual, but I think you'll understand once I explain the situation." I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, accepting the coffee Mrs. Patterson brought with hands that trembled slightly despite my efforts to appear calm. "Mr. Harrison, I have to admit you're making me a little nervous. Is there something wrong with Dad's estate? Something Ryan missed when he was handling the paperwork?" Mr. Harrison's expression shifted slightly, a barely perceptible change that suggested surprise. Miss Collins, what exactly did your brother tell you about your father's estate? That everything was straightforward. The house went to Mom, along with his life insurance and retirement savings. There were some small debts that needed to be settled, but nothing complicated. Ryan said he was handling all the legal details, so I wouldn't have to worry about it. Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him in a gesture I remembered from childhood Sunday services when he would listen to particularly complicated confessions, with the patience of a man accustomed to untangling human complications. Miss Collins, I'm afraid your brother may have misunderstood the situation. Or perhaps I should say, he understood only part of it. A cold feeling began to spread through my chest, the kind of dread that came when you realized that something you'd accepted as truth might not be true at all. What do you mean? Your father left very specific instructions regarding his estate. Very specific and very unusual instructions. Mr. Harrison reached for a thick folder that sat on the corner of his desk, opening it to reveal documents that looked far more complex than anything Ryan had described. He wanted me to wait exactly 2 years after his death before revealing the complete details of his will to the primary beneficiary. The primary beneficiary? I repeated, confused. But Mom is the primary beneficiary, isn't she? No, Miss Collins, you are. The words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me momentarily unable to process their meaning. I'm sorry, what? Your father left the bulk of his estate to you, Emma. The house, the rental properties, the investment accounts, and a substantial life insurance policy that your family was not aware existed. Your mother was provided for, certainly, but you are the primary heir to everything your father built. I stared at him, my mind struggling to reconcile this information with everything I'd been told for the past 2 years. That's not possible. Ryan said the house belonged to Mom. He said there wasn't much money left after the debts were paid. The house does belong to your mother, but only as a life estate. When she passes away, it reverts to you. As for the other assets, well, your brother was not made aware of their existence because your father specifically requested that this information remain confidential until today. Mr. Harrison pulled out a document that bore my father's familiar signature, his handwriting still legible despite the 2 years that had passed since his death. Your father was quite clear about his reasoning. He wanted to observe how the family treated you in his absence, how they valued your contributions and your choices. He was particularly concerned about the pressure you might face to change careers or abandon the work you loved. He was testing them, I said, the realization hitting me with stunning clarity. In a way, yes. Your father was a shrewd judge of character, Emma. He understood that people reveal their true nature when they believe there are no consequences for their actions. He wanted to see how his family would treat you when they thought you had no power, no financial independence, no alternative but to accept their judgment. I thought about the past 2 years, the constant suggestions that I should change careers, the subtle and not so subtle implications that my choices were evidence of limited ambition or poor judgment. I thought about Thursday's dinner, about Ryan's casual cruelty and my mother's resigned acceptance of my supposed failure. They failed his test, I said quietly. Spectacularly, Mr. Harrison agreed, his tone carrying a hint of disappointment that suggested he had hoped for a different outcome. Your father left detailed instructions about what should happen if the family proved unable to see your worth. Those instructions included this meeting and the transfer of assets that should have happened immediately upon his death. He handed me a letter written in my father's careful script, my name written across the front in the handwriting that had signed permission slips and report cards throughout my childhood. My hand shook as I opened it, seeing his words for the first time since the funeral. My dearest Emma, the letter began, if you are reading this, it means that 2 years have passed since my death, and that the family has proven unable to value the extraordinary woman you have become. I am sorry that it has taken so long for you to learn the truth about how much I believed in you and your choices. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading, my father's voice speaking to me from beyond the grave with words I had desperately needed to hear during the darkest moments of family criticism. You are always the child who understood what truly mattered in life. While Ryan chased success that could be measured in dollars and recognition, you chose a path that measured success and lives changed and futures brightened. I have watched you become a teacher, not because you couldn't do anything else, but because you understood that teaching was the most important work in the world. The letter went on to explain his decision to keep the inheritance secret, his hope that the family would see my worth without the influence of financial considerations, and his profound disappointment that they had failed to do so. I am leaving you everything because you are the only one who truly understood the values that built this family's wealth in the first place. You are the only one who chose meaning over money, service over status, and love over luxury. Use these resources to continue the work you love, and know that every day you spend in that classroom is a day that makes me proud to be your father. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face, not from sadness but from a kind of overwhelming relief. My father had seen me, had understood my choices, had valued the work that everyone else dismissed as inadequate. "There's more," Mr. Harrison said gently, handing me another document. "Your father owned 3 rental properties downtown that have been managed by a property company for the past 15 years. The income from those properties has been accumulating in an investment account that now contains approximately $150,000. I stared at the numbers on the page, struggling to comprehend their reality. "I don't understand. How did I not know about any of this?" "Your father was very private about his investments. He purchased the properties gradually, using income from his real estate business that he kept separate from the family's day-to-day finances. He wanted to ensure that his children's love for him was not influenced by their knowledge of his wealth. And the life insurance policy? $75,000, with you as the sole beneficiary. It was a separate policy from the one your mother received, taken out specifically to provide you with financial security." The magnitude of what I was learning began to settle over me like a warm blanket, wrapping around the years of financial anxiety and family criticism that had shaped my adult life. I thought about the nights I'd lain awake worrying about my retirement savings, about whether I'd be able to afford health care as I aged, about the careful budgeting that governed every purchase I made. "Emma," Mr. Harrison said, his voice gentle but firm, "you are financially independent. You can continue teaching because you love it, not because you have no other choice. You can make decisions about your life based on your values rather than your bank account balance." "Why now?" I asked, wiping my eyes with the tissue Mrs. Patterson had thoughtfully provided. "Why did he wait 2 years? Your father believed that grief could cloud judgment, that the immediate aftermath of his death was not the time for major revelations. He wanted the family to settle into their new normal, to reveal their true attitudes about your life and choices, without the complicating factor of inheritance considerations." I thought about the timing, about how the family's criticism had intensified over the past 2 years, how their suggestions about career changes had become more frequent and more pointed. They had shown their true colors during what they believed was my most vulnerable period, when they thought I had no resources and no alternatives to accepting their guidance. "There's one more thing," Mr. Harrison said, reaching for another document. "Your father left specific instructions about how this information should be shared with the rest of the family. He wanted you to have the choice about when and how they learn about your inheritance, but he also wanted you to have some protection against their inevitable reactions. He handed me a legal document that outlined the irrevocable nature of the inheritance, the protections in place to prevent family members from contesting the will, and the clear documentation of my father's mental competency at the time the documents were drafted. Your inheritance is completely secure, Emma. No one can challenge it, change it, or convince you to share it against your wishes. Your father made sure of that." The relief that washed over me was profound and immediate. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly free from the weight of family expectations, from the pressure to justify my choices to people who had never understood their value in the first place. "What happens next?" I asked, my voice stronger than it had been since I'd entered the office. "That depends entirely on what you want to happen. The properties can continue to be managed professionally, generating income that requires minimal involvement from you. The investment account can be transferred to your name immediately. The house will remain your mother's home for as long as she lives, but you are now the legal owner of the property." I sat in the leather chair, holding the documents that represented my father's love and confidence, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had walked into this office an hour ago had been the family disappointment, the daughter who had failed to live up to her potential. The woman who would walk out was a property owner, an investor, a person of independent means who could choose her path based on her values rather than her circumstances. I need some time to process all of this, I said, though my mind was already racing with possibilities. Of course, take all the time you need. But Emma, I want you to know that your father would be immensely proud of the woman you've become. He often spoke about your dedication to your students, your integrity, your kindness. He saw what the rest of the family seemed unable to see. As I gathered the documents and prepared to leave, Mr. Harrison stood and walked around his desk to hand me one final envelope. Your father asked me to give you this after you'd had time to absorb the financial information. He said it contained his thoughts about how you might want to use your inheritance to continue making the difference in the world that you've already begun. I tucked the envelope into my purse alongside the other documents, my mind still reeling from the morning's revelations. As I stepped out of the law office into the crisp November air, I felt like I was seeing Cedar Falls with new eyes. The elementary school where I taught was visible from Elm Street, its brick facade familiar and welcoming, but now it represented a choice rather than a necessity. I walked slowly back toward my apartment, past the courthouse where my father had filed the documents that would change my life, past the diner where he used to take me for milkshakes when I was young, and full of dreams about becoming a teacher. The town looked the same, but everything had changed in the space of a single morning. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace, asking how my mysterious appointment had gone, followed by another from Principal Watson confirming that my substitute was handling my classes for the day. The normal rhythms of my life continued around me, but I felt disconnected from them, floating in a space between my old reality and a new one I was still trying to understand. I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment above Murphy's Bakery, the familiar creak of the steps sounding different somehow, as if even the building recognized that something fundamental had shifted. Inside my small living space, I spread the documents across my kitchen table, the same table where I graded papers and ate solitary dinners, where I had planned lessons and worried about my future. The legal papers looked official and intimidating, but they represented something I had never expected to possess: options. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions based purely on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. I could continue teaching because I loved it, not because I had no other marketable skills. I could live in this small apartment because it suited me, not because it was all I could manage financially. I opened the final envelope from my father, unfolding pages of his careful handwriting that outlined his vision for how I might use the inheritance to expand my impact beyond the walls of a single classroom. He had researched educational nonprofits, scholarship programs, and community initiatives that supported children from low-income families. He had imagined ways that my passion for education could be amplified by financial resources, ways that I could make a difference on a larger scale while still maintaining the direct connection with students that gave my life meaning. "You have always understood that education is the great equalizer," he had written. "These resources could help you ensure that more children have access to the kind of educational opportunities that change lives. You could fund programs, support teachers, or create scholarships that open doors for students who remind you of yourself at their age." As I read his suggestions, I felt a new kind of excitement building in my chest. Not the excitement of sudden wealth, but the excitement of possibility, of the chance to do meaningful work on a scale I had never imagined possible. I could still teach, still spend my days with children who needed to know that someone believed in them, but I could also reach beyond my classroom, to touch more lives, to create more opportunities, to build the kind of legacy that my father had envisioned when he made his extraordinary decision. I thought about Thursday's dinner, about Ryan's casual cruelty and the family's collective dismissal of my choices. They had seen my modest lifestyle as evidence of failure, never imagining that it reflected values rather than limitations. They had pitied my independence, never realizing that it was about to become something much more powerful than the financial dependence they had assumed defined my future. The irony was not lost on me that my father's wealth, accumulated through the same real estate business that Ryan now dominated, was being passed to the daughter who had chosen teaching over profit, service over status. He had seen something in my choices that the rest of the family had missed, had understood that my commitment to education represented the kind of character that could be trusted with resources and responsibility. I spent the rest of the morning reading and rereading the documents, calling Mr. Harrison twice with questions about property management and investment strategies, slowly beginning to understand the scope of what I had inherited. By afternoon, the initial shock had settled into a quiet amazement, a deep gratitude not just for the financial security, but for the validation that came with knowing my father had understood and valued my choices. As evening approached, I found myself thinking about the conversation I would eventually need to have with my family. They would learn about the inheritance eventually, though I now had the power to control when and how that revelation occurred. The thought of their reactions filled me with a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness, pleasure at the justice of it balanced by sorrow that it had come to this. I called Grace, needing to share the news with someone who would understand its significance, someone who had witnessed my struggles with family expectations and financial constraints. "Emma, what's going on? You missed an entire day of school, which has never happened in the 7 years I've known you." "Grace, you're not going to believe what happened today," I said, settling into my armchair with the phone pressed against my ear. "My father left me an inheritance. A substantial inheritance that I didn't know existed until this morning." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Grace? Are you there?" "I'm here. I'm just processing. How substantial are we talking about?" I told her everything. From the morning phone call to the final envelope, watching the sun set over Cedar Falls as I shared the details of my transformed circumstances. Grace listened without interruption, occasionally gasping or making small sounds of amazement, but letting me tell the story at my own pace. "Emma," she said when I finished, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and concern. "This is incredible. But how are you feeling? About all of it? This is a lot to absorb in one day." "I feel like I've been holding my breath for 2 years and can finally exhale," I said, surprised by the truth of the statement. "I feel like my father saw me in a way that no one else in my family ever has. I feel like I can finally stop apologizing for who I am." "And what are you going to do about Ryan and your mother?" It was the question I had been avoiding all day, though I knew it would need to be answered eventually. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to call them right now and tell them exactly what I think about their treatment of me. Part of me wants to wait and see how long it takes them to figure it out on their own." "What does your gut tell you?" I considered the question, thinking about the woman I had been that morning and the woman I was becoming in the wake of the day's revelations. "My gut tells me to take my time. To let this settle. To make decisions from a place of strength rather than anger." That sounds very wise, and very much like the Emma I know. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my small apartment, looking at the documents that represented my new reality. Outside, Cedar Falls was settling into its evening rhythm, porch lights coming on in houses where families were gathering for dinner, where children were being helped with homework, where the ordinary business of life continued unchanged. But inside my small space above the bakery, everything had changed. I was no longer the family disappointment, the daughter who had failed to live up to her potential. I was the inheritor of my father's legacy, the keeper of his values, the person he had trusted to use his resources in ways that honored the principles they had both shared. Tomorrow I would return to my classroom, would spend my day with children who needed to believe in their own potential, would continue the work that had always given my life meaning. But I would do it with the knowledge that my father had seen the value in that work, had understood its importance, had trusted me with the resources to expand its impact. I was no longer just Emma Collins, the teacher who lived above a bakery and drove an old car and worried about her retirement savings. I was Emma Collins, educator and inheritor, a woman with the means to make her values manifest in the world, a daughter who had finally received the validation she had always craved but never expected to find. The transformation was complete, though the rest of the world would not know it for some time yet. I had been tested by my family and found wanting in their eyes, but I had been trusted by my father and found worthy in his. The difference between those two judgments would shape everything that came next, would determine how I moved forward from this moment of revelation into whatever future I chose to create. For now, it was enough to sit in the quiet of my small apartment, holding the evidence of my father's love and trust, feeling the weight of possibility settle around me like a blessing I had never thought to request but desperately needed to receive. The first thing I did the next morning was call in sick, not because I was actually ill, but because I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to move forward with information that had fundamentally altered my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my life and my family. I spent Tuesday walking through downtown Cedar Falls, seeing it with new eyes as I passed the 3 rental properties that now belonged to me. The first was a small duplex on Oak Street, painted yellow with white trim flower boxes under the windows that suggested tenants who cared about their home. The second was a converted Victorian on Maple Avenue that had been divided into 4 apartments, each with its own entrance and small garden space. The third surprised me the most, a renovated storefront on Main Street that housed the town's only bookstore on the ground floor and a cozy apartment above. I had walked past these buildings hundreds of times over the years, never knowing they were connected to my family, never imagining that my father had been quietly building a portfolio that would one day provide me with the independence I had never dared to dream possible. Each property was well maintained, clearly managed by professionals who understood the value of keeping tenants happy and buildings in good repair. Standing outside the bookstore, I watched through the window as Mrs. Chen arranged a display of holiday novels, her movements efficient and practiced. She had been running Turning Pages for 15 years, ever since her husband died and left her with more books than she knew what to do with, and a need for income that Social Security couldn't quite cover. I wondered if she knew that her rent now went to the quiet teacher who lived above the bakery, if she would treat me differently once she learned that our relationship had shifted from customer and business owner to tenant and landlord. The weight of responsibility settled over me as I realized that these properties weren't just assets, they were homes and businesses that affected real people's lives. Mrs. Chen's bookstore was a gathering place for the town's readers, a space where book clubs met and children came for story time on Saturday mornings. The apartments housed young families and elderly widows and college students home from Ohio State. My father had been more than an investor in these properties. He had been a steward of community spaces that mattered to the people who lived and worked in them. I pulled out my phone and called the property management company, a small firm 2 towns over, that handled maintenance requests and rent collection for a dozen small landlords in the area. The woman who answered, Carol Jenkins, had worked with my father for over a decade and knew the properties as well as anyone. "Miss Collins, Mr. Harrison told us you'd be calling. Your father spoke of you often, you know. He was so proud of your teaching career, always said you understood what really mattered in life." "I'm still learning about everything he built," I admitted, walking slowly down Main Street as we talked. "I'd like to understand more about how the properties are managed, what kind of tenants we have, whether there are any issues I should know about. Your father was very hands-on, even though he worked through us. He approved every tenant personally, always chose people who would take care of the spaces, rather than those who could pay the highest rent. Mrs. Chen at the bookstore, for instance, has been paying below market rate for years, because your father believed the community needed that bookstore more than he needed maximum profit." This revelation didn't surprise me, but it deepened my understanding of the man my father had been when my family wasn't watching. He had used his wealth not just to accumulate more wealth, but to support the kind of community he wanted to live in, to ensure that Cedar Falls remained the kind of place where small businesses could thrive and working families could afford decent housing. "I'd like to continue that approach," I said, surprised by how quickly the decision came, how natural it felt to step into the role my father had envisioned for me. "I'd like to meet with you this week to go over everything, to understand how decisions are made, and what my involvement should be." "I think your father would be pleased to hear that. He often said he hoped you would see these properties as more than just investments, that you would understand their role in the community." We arranged to meet Thursday afternoon, giving me time to process everything I was learning while maintaining the appearance of normalcy in my daily routine. Wednesday morning found me back in my classroom, standing in front of 26 third graders who had no idea that their teacher's life had been transformed over the past few days. "Miss Collins, you look different," Madison Thompson announced during morning circle time, her 8-year-old honesty cutting straight to the heart of things as children's observations often did. "Different how?" I asked, genuinely curious about what changes might be visible to someone who knew me well enough to notice subtle shifts. "Happier, I think." Like when my mom got the job at the hospital and stopped worrying about money all the time. The comparison hit closer to home than Madison could have known, but it also made me realize that the relief I felt was apparently visible to people who paid attention. For the first time in my adult life, I was teaching because I loved it, rather than because I needed the income, and apparently that freedom showed in ways I hadn't expected. The day passed in the familiar rhythm of lessons and discoveries, reading groups and math centers, the organized chaos of 26 young minds working to understand the world around them. But underneath the normal routine, I found myself thinking about my father's suggestions for using the inheritance to expand educational opportunities, wondering how I might create programs that would benefit children like these, children who deserved more resources and smaller class sizes and newer textbooks than the current budget allowed. During lunch, Grace cornered me in the teacher's lounge, her expression mixing concern with barely contained curiosity. "You seem different today," she said, echoing Madison's earlier observation. "Calmer, maybe, less stressed about something." "I think I'm beginning to understand what my father saw in my choices," I said, unwrapping the sandwich I'd packed that morning. "I think I'm beginning to see myself through his eyes instead of through the family's eyes." "That's huge, Emma. That's everything, really." "I've been thinking about what you said a few weeks ago, about the difference between being intimidated by someone's calling and being impressed by it. I think my father was impressed by what I do, even if the rest of the family sees it as settling for less." Grace studied my face with the careful attention that good teachers learn to apply to their students, reading the signs of internal change that might not be immediately obvious to casual observers. "There's something else, isn't there? Something you're not telling me?" I hesitated, not because I didn't trust Grace, but because speaking the truth aloud would make it more real, would move me from the private space of processing into the public space of decision-making and action. "My father left me more than I initially understood," I said finally. "Much more. Enough to change everything about how I think about my future, about what's possible." "Emma, that's wonderful. But also probably overwhelming?" "Terrifying and liberating at the same time," I admitted. "I've spent so many years making decisions based on what I could afford, that I'm not sure how to make decisions based on what I want." "What do you want?" The question was simple, but it required an answer I hadn't had to give in years. What did I want? Divorced from considerations of practicality and family expectations and financial limitations. "I want to keep teaching," I said, the words coming easily, because they reflected a truth I had never questioned. "But I also want to do more. I want to create programs for kids who need extra support. I want to fund scholarships for students whose families can't afford college. I want to make sure that financial circumstances don't limit what children can achieve." "That sounds exactly like something you would want," Grace said, her smile warm with recognition. "That sounds like Emma Collins, with resources to match her values." The bell rang, calling us back to our afternoon responsibilities, but Grace's words stayed with me as I taught science and social studies, as I helped struggling readers and celebrated small victories in multiplication tables. Emma Collins, with resources to match her values. The phrase felt like a description of someone I was becoming rather than someone I had always been. That evening, my phone rang with my mother's contact information, the first time she had called since Thanksgiving dinner. I stared at the screen for several rings before answering, not sure what kind of conversation awaited me. "Emma, sweetheart, I've been thinking about Thursday night," she began, her voice carrying the careful tone that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation. "I think we all said things we didn't mean. Family gatherings can be so stressful, and sometimes people don't express themselves as well as they should." This was my mother's way of apologizing without actually apologizing, of acknowledging that something unpleasant had happened without taking responsibility for her role in creating the unpleasantness. "I meant everything I said," I replied, my voice calm despite the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. "And I think Ryan meant everything he said too. Oh, Emma, you know your brother loves you. He just worries about your future, about whether you're prepared for the challenges that come with getting older. He called me the family disappointment, Mom, in front of his children. That wasn't worry, that was cruelty." "He was frustrated, dear. You know how he gets when he thinks someone isn't living up to their potential." The phrase "living up to their potential" hit me differently now that I knew about my inheritance, now that I understood my father's perspective on my choices. According to my father's assessment, I had exceeded my potential by choosing values over profit, by dedicating my life to work that mattered more than work that paid well. Maybe Ryan's definition of potential is different from mine, I said. Maybe there are ways to measure success that don't involve bank account balances and luxury cars. Of course there are, sweetheart. No one is saying money is everything. But it does provide security. And security allows you to be generous with others, to help family when they need it. I caught the subtle implication in her words, the suggestion that my modest income had prevented me from being the kind of family member who could provide financial support when needed. The irony was almost laughable, given that I now had the resources to help anyone in the family but no longer felt obligated to do so. I've been thinking about generosity lately, I said, choosing my words carefully. About the difference between helping people and enabling them. About whether it's generous to give people what they want or what they actually need. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. I mean that sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their choices instead of rescuing them from those consequences. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear my mother trying to decode the meaning behind my words, trying to determine whether I was speaking generally or specifically about family dynamics. Emma, you're not still upset about Thursday, are you? Because if you are, I think you should talk to Ryan directly. Clear the air between you. I'm not upset, Mom. I'm enlightened. There's a difference. What do you mean by that? I mean that Thursday night showed me exactly how my family sees me. Exactly what they think of my choices and my life. And instead of being hurt by that, I'm grateful for the clarity. Sweetheart, I think you're reading too much into a dinner conversation that got a little heated. No one thinks poorly of your choices. Ryan literally called me the family disappointment. He was having a difficult day. Ashley told me later that they're having some stress at work, some issues with a big development deal that's been more complicated than expected. This was how it always went with my mother, the way unpleasant truths were explained away by circumstances, the way cruelty was reframed as stress or misunderstanding. Ryan's behavior was always excused by external pressures, his harsh words dismissed as evidence of his passion rather than his character. Stress doesn't excuse cruelty, Mom, and success doesn't give someone the right to belittle other people's choices. No one was trying to belittle anything, Emma. We love you exactly as you are. Do you, though? Because Thursday night felt like a family that loves who they think I should be, not who I actually am. Another long pause, followed by the sound of my mother's sigh, the exhalation that suggested she was reaching the end of her patience with a conversation that wasn't going according to her planned script. I think you're being overly sensitive about this whole situation. Family members sometimes say things they don't mean when emotions are running high. The mature thing to do is forgive and move forward. I have moved forward, I said, realizing as I spoke the words that they were true. I've moved forward from needing my family's approval to define my worth. I've moved forward from apologizing for choices that I'm proud of. Emma, I don't understand why you're being so dramatic about this. It was one dinner conversation. It was a lifetime of dinner conversations, Mom. Thursday was just the first time the truth was spoken out loud, instead of implied through careful suggestions and disappointed sighs. I could hear the frustration building in her voice, the irritation that came when someone refused to follow the script that would restore family harmony through forgiveness and forgetfulness. Fine. If that's how you want to interpret things, I suppose that's your choice. But I think you're making a mistake, Emma. I think you're letting pride get in the way of family relationships. And I think I'm finally learning the difference between family relationships built on love and family relationships built on obligation, I replied. I think I'm finally understanding that some relationships aren't worth preserving if they require me to diminish myself to maintain them. After we hung up, I sat in my small living room feeling lighter than I had in years. The conversation with my mother had been difficult, but it had also been clarifying, confirming that my family's love was indeed conditional on my willingness to accept their judgment and their definitions of success and failure. For the first time, I found myself genuinely looking forward to my meeting with Carol Jenkins, eager to learn more about the properties and the tenants, excited about the possibility of using my resources to make a positive difference in the community. I spent the evening researching educational nonprofits and scholarship programs, reading about successful initiatives that had used private funding to expand opportunities for children from low-income families. Thursday's meeting with Carol Jenkins took place in her small office above the hardware store, a space filled with filing cabinets and photographs of the various properties she managed throughout the county. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and practical clothes, someone who had spent decades dealing with the realities of rental properties and the complicated relationships between landlords and tenants. "Your father was unusual among the landlords I work with," she told me as we reviewed the financial records for each property. "Most people in this business are focused on maximizing profit, but Tom cared more about maintaining quality housing and supporting local businesses." She showed me photographs of each property, before and after shots that documented the improvements my father had funded over the years. New roofs and updated electrical systems, fresh paint and landscaping that made the buildings attractive to tenants who took pride in their homes. The duplex on Oak Street is occupied by a young family with 2 children and an elderly woman who's lived there for 8 years. Both tenants have been exemplary, never late with rent, very careful with the property. The Victorian on Maple has 4 units, all occupied by long-term tenants, including a retired teacher and a young couple who just got married. "A retired teacher?" I asked, interested in this connection to my own profession. "Margaret Walsh. She taught at the high school for 35 years before retiring. Your father gave her a significant rent reduction when she moved to a fixed income, said the community owed her a debt for all the children she had educated over the years." This detail about my father's approach to the properties filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with financial gain. He had used his wealth to honor people who had dedicated their lives to service, to ensure that teachers and bookstore owners and working families could afford decent housing in a community they had helped build. "I'd like to continue that approach," I said. "I'd like to make sure the properties serve the community as well as generating income." "That's exactly what your father hoped you would say." He often talked about his vision for responsible property ownership, about the role that landlords could play in supporting rather than exploiting their communities. We spent 2 hours going over every detail of the properties, from maintenance schedules to tenant histories to future improvement plans. By the end of the meeting, I felt confident about my ability to step into the role my father had prepared for me, to be the kind of property owner who saw tenants as community members rather than sources of revenue. That evening, as I was grading spelling tests and planning the next day's lessons, my phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "Mom said you're still upset about Thanksgiving. We should talk. Coffee Saturday morning?" I stared at the message for several minutes, considering my options. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to avoid the confrontation that would inevitably follow any honest conversation about our family dynamics. But another part of me was curious about what Ryan would say, how he would frame his behavior, whether he would offer a genuine apology or simply another explanation for why his cruelty had been justified. "Fine," I texted back. "Murphy's Cafe, 9 a.m. Murphy's Cafe sat directly below my apartment, a small space that served excellent coffee and pastries to the early morning crowd of commuters and retirees who gathered to discuss local politics and weather patterns. I arrived 5 minutes early, choosing a table in the corner where we could talk without being overheard by the regular customers who knew both of our families and would certainly be interested in any conversation between the Collins siblings. Ryan arrived exactly on time, looking like he had dressed carefully for the occasion in khakis, and a button-down shirt that suggested he was treating this meeting as a business appointment rather than a family reconciliation. He ordered his usual black coffee and settled into the chair across from me with the kind of controlled composure that suggested he had planned what he was going to say. "Emma, I think we need to clear the air about last week," he began, his tone suggesting that he was doing me a favor by agreeing to have this conversation. "I may have been a little harsh in how I expressed my concerns about your career situation." "A little harsh?" I repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. "Is that how you remember it?" "Look, I admit I could have chosen my words more carefully. But the substance of what I said was true. You're smart enough to do anything. And I hate seeing you limit yourself to a job that doesn't provide the kind of security you're going to need as you get older. And calling me the family disappointment was your way of expressing concern for my security?" Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was caught in behavior he couldn't easily justify. That was unfair. I was frustrated, and I said something I shouldn't have said. But Emma, you have to understand where I'm coming from. I see you struggling financially, living in this tiny apartment, driving a car that's on its last legs, and I know you're capable of so much more. More according to who? According to anyone who knows you, according to common sense, according to basic financial planning. I sipped my coffee, studying my brother's face as he spoke, seeing the genuine belief that his perspective was not only correct but obvious to any reasonable person. He truly believed that my modest lifestyle was evidence of failure rather than choice, that my dedication to teaching represented a lack of ambition rather than a different set of values. Ryan, what if I told you that I'm perfectly happy with my life as it is? What if I told you that I don't want a bigger apartment, or a newer car, or a different career? I'd say you're lying to yourself. I'd say you've convinced yourself that you don't want those things because you don't think you can have them. And what if I told you that I can have them, but choose not to, because they're not important to me? Ryan laughed, the sound carrying a mixture of disbelief and condescension that made me realize how little he actually knew about my values or my priorities. Emma, you're a teacher. You make $35,000 a year. You can't afford to turn down opportunities for advancement just because you're attached to finger paints and story time. You really think that's what teaching is? Finger paints and story time? I think teaching is a job for people who can't handle the pressure of real careers. I think it's a job for people who want summers off and early dismissal times, and the kind of schedule that appeals to people who don't want to work too hard. The contempt in his voice was so complete, so absolute, that I felt something shift inside me, the last vestiges of hope that he might understand or respect my choices finally disappearing completely. You know what, Ryan? You're right about one thing. We absolutely needed to clear the air, because now I know exactly what you think of me and exactly what you think of the work I do. Emma, don't be dramatic. I'm trying to help you see opportunities you might be missing. No, you're trying to convince me that my life is a mistake because it doesn't look like yours. You're trying to make me ashamed of choices that I'm proud of, because those choices challenge your assumptions about what matters in life. I'm trying to look out for my sister. You're trying to remake your sister into someone who validates your worldview, someone who confirms that your definition of success is the only definition that matters. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from attempted patience to obvious irritation. Fine. You want to spend your life babysitting other people's kids for poverty wages? That's your choice. But don't expect the family to pretend that's a smart decision just to make you feel better about it. I don't expect anything from this family anymore, I said, my voice calm despite the anger building in my chest. I don't expect understanding or support or even basic respect. I expect exactly what I've been getting for years, which is judgment and condescension, and the constant suggestion that I should be ashamed of who I am. You're being ridiculous. Am I? Because from where I sit, it looks like I'm being honest for the first time in years. It looks like I'm finally admitting that this family has never accepted me as I am, has never valued my contributions, has never seen my choices as anything other than evidence of limited ambition or poor judgment. Ryan stared at me across the small table, his confusion evident in the way his confident composure was beginning to crack around the edges. Emma, where is this coming from? You've never talked like this before. Maybe I've never felt strong enough to talk like this before. Maybe I've finally realized that I don't need your approval to know my own worth. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it became increasingly clear that we were speaking different languages, operating from fundamentally different assumptions about what constituted a meaningful life. Ryan saw my career as evidence of settling for less, while I saw his career as evidence of prioritizing profit over purpose. He saw my modest lifestyle as proof of financial irresponsibility, while I saw his expensive lifestyle as proof that he had confused wealth with worth. By the time we parted ways, both of us were frustrated, and neither of us had moved any closer to understanding the other's perspective. But for me, the conversation had served a crucial purpose, confirming that my family's inability to see my value was not a failure on my part, but a limitation on theirs. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I felt a sense of completion, as if the last piece of a complicated puzzle had finally fallen into place. I understood now why my father had waited 2 years to reveal the inheritance. why he had wanted to observe how the family treated me in his absence. He had known that their true feelings would eventually surface, that their respect for me had always been contingent on their belief that I had no other options. I spent the weekend researching scholarship programs and educational initiatives, beginning to develop a plan for how I might use my inheritance to expand opportunities for children whose families couldn't afford the kind of educational advantages that middle-class children took for granted. I read about after-school programs and summer enrichment camps, about literacy initiatives and college preparation courses, about all the ways that private funding could supplement public education budgets that were stretched too thin to provide everything that children needed to reach their full potential. For the first time in my adult life, I was planning my future based on what I wanted to accomplish rather than what I could afford to attempt. It felt like breathing after years of holding my breath, like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. Monday morning found me back in my classroom with a new sense of purpose, seeing my students not just as the children I was responsible for this year, but as representatives of all the children I might be able to help, through scholarships and programs and initiatives that would outlast my own teaching career. I looked at Madison Thompson, whose parents worked 2 jobs each to make ends meet, and thought about summer camps and tutoring programs that could provide her with opportunities her family couldn't afford. I looked at Tyler Morrison, whose learning differences required extra support that the school district's budget couldn't provide, and thought about funding specialized programs that would help children like him succeed. The inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had given me a vision for how to multiply the impact of work I already loved, how to reach beyond the walls of my own classroom to touch more lives and create more opportunities. I was no longer just Emma Collins, the teacher who lived above the bakery. I was Emma Collins, educator and advocate, someone with the resources to transform dreams into reality for children who deserved every chance to succeed. The first sign that news of my inheritance had spread through Cedar Falls came 3 days later, when Mrs. Chen from the bookstore knocked on my apartment door, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and wearing an expression of nervous gratitude. "Emma dear, I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she began, her hands trembling slightly as she offered the cookies. "I just learned that you're my new landlord, and I wanted to thank you personally for allowing me to continue running the bookstore." I invited her in for tea, touched by her gesture but saddened by the anxiety in her voice. Over the past decade, Mrs. Chen had created a community hub in her small storefront, hosting book clubs and children's story hours, providing a gathering place for readers who might otherwise have nowhere to discuss their latest discoveries. "Mrs. Chen, you don't need to thank me," I said as we settled at my kitchen table. "Your bookstore is exactly the kind of business that makes Cedar Falls special. I would never want to change that." "Your father was very kind to me," she said, her eyes misting with emotion. "When my husband died and I thought I might lose the store, he reduced my rent and gave me time to build up the customer base. He said the community needed a bookstore more than he needed maximum profit." This conversation was the first of many that helped me understand the full scope of my father's impact on the community. Over the following weeks, tenants from each of my properties reached out to express their gratitude and share stories about how my father had helped them during difficult times. Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher, told me about the scholarship fund he had quietly maintained for former students who needed help with college expenses. The young family in the duplex described how he had waived late fees when the father was laid off from the factory. Each story painted a picture of a man who had used his wealth strategically and compassionately, who had understood that true success meant lifting others up rather than simply accumulating assets. I began to see that my inheritance wasn't just money and property. It was a legacy of service that came with both opportunities and obligations. Meanwhile, my family's reaction to the inheritance revelation played out exactly as I might have predicted. Ryan called twice daily for the first week, alternating between attempts at emotional manipulation and barely controlled anger. His messages ranged from reminders of family loyalty to accusations of selfishness, from promises that he would use any shared inheritance responsibly to threats that he would contest the will, despite Mr. Harrison's assurances that such efforts would be futile. My mother's approach was subtler but no less persistent. She sent cards with handwritten notes about family unity, left voicemails about upcoming holidays that would feel empty without proper family celebration, and enlisted Ashley to make carefully orchestrated visits to my school during dismissal time, hoping to catch me in public where I might be more susceptible to pressure. But the most revealing response came from Uncle Pete, who called on a Saturday morning while I was planning lessons for the upcoming week. "Emma, I heard about what happened with the inheritance," he said, his voice warm with something that sounded like pride. "I wanted you to know that Tom talked to me about his decision several times over the years. He was very sure about what he was doing and why." "He discussed it with you?" "He was worried about how the family treated you, especially after you graduated college, and chose teaching over some of the other opportunities you had. He said he watched them pressure you to be ashamed of work that made you happy, and it broke his heart." Uncle Pete went on to explain that my father had been planning the inheritance structure for nearly 5 years, consulting with financial advisors and attorneys to ensure that his wishes would be carried out exactly as he intended. "He didn't want you to know while he was alive because he was afraid it might change your relationship with him," Uncle Pete continued. "But he also didn't want you to spend your life thinking that nobody valued what you were doing. He wanted you to know that at least one person saw your worth clearly." This conversation provided a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed, confirmation that my father's decision had been deliberate and thoughtful, rather than impulsive or punitive. It also gave me the confidence to move forward with my plans for the inheritance, without second-guessing his intentions or my own judgment. I spent December working with financial advisors to structure the educational foundation I wanted to create, consulting with local school administrators to identify the most pressing needs in our district and surrounding communities. The foundation would focus on 3 main areas: scholarships for college-bound students from low-income families, funding for enrichment programs that public school budgets couldn't support, and professional development opportunities for teachers who wanted to expand their skills but couldn't afford the training costs. The work energized me in ways I hadn't expected, combining my passion for education with strategic thinking about resource allocation and program development. I found myself staying up late researching successful educational nonprofits, studying their approaches and adapting their strategies for our local needs. In January, I received a call from the principal of Cedar Falls High School, asking if I would be willing to speak at a school board meeting about educational funding challenges. The invitation surprised me until I realized that word of my foundation had begun to spread through the professional education community, creating opportunities for advocacy that I had never pursued before. The school board meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the high school auditorium, the same space where I had graduated valedictorian 15 years earlier. As I stood at the podium looking out at an audience of teachers, parents, and community members, I felt the weight of my father's trust and the confidence that came from knowing I was using his resources exactly as he had hoped. "Education is not a luxury that some children deserve and others don't," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "It's the foundation that allows every child to reach their potential, regardless of their family's economic circumstances. When we underfund our schools, when we fail to provide enrichment opportunities, when we allow financial barriers to determine which children get extra support, we waste human potential on a massive scale." I spoke for 20 minutes about the programs my foundation would support, about the scholarships that would open college doors for students whose families had never imagined higher education as a possibility. I talked about after-school tutoring that could help struggling readers catch up to grade level, about summer enrichment camps that would prevent the learning loss that affected low-income students disproportionately. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several teachers approaching me afterward to discuss specific students who could benefit from foundation support. Parents shared stories about children whose potential was being limited by economic circumstances, and school board members asked detailed questions about how the foundation would coordinate with existing district programs. As I left the meeting that night, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal validation and everything to do with the knowledge that my father's money would soon be creating opportunities for children who needed them most. The foundation officially launched in March with a modest ceremony at the elementary school where I taught. Grace had helped organize the event, inviting local media and community leaders to learn about the programs we would be funding. I stood in the familiar hallway where I had spent 8 years nurturing young minds, surrounded by colleagues who understood the challenges we faced and community members who wanted to see children succeed. The Collins Educational Foundation exists because one man understood that education changes lives, I said during my brief remarks. My father believed that every child deserves the chance to discover their gifts and develop their talents, regardless of their zip code or their family's bank account. This foundation is his legacy, and it will be my privilege to carry out his vision. The first scholarships were awarded that spring to 5 high school seniors who had overcome significant obstacles to maintain strong academic records. Madison Thompson's older sister was among the recipients, a young woman who had worked part-time throughout high school to help support her family but had never let the job interfere with her studies. Watching her accept the scholarship that would allow her to attend Ohio State tuition-free, I felt my father's presence as clearly as if he had been standing beside me. By summer, the foundation was funding 3 different after-school programs, providing supplies and training for teachers who wanted to implement innovative curriculum projects, and supporting a summer literacy camp that served 50 children who might otherwise have lost reading skills during the break from school. Each program launch brought its own satisfactions, but the most meaningful moments came from direct interactions with the children and families we were helping. I visited the literacy camp one July afternoon and found 8-year-old Marcus, one of my former students, confidently reading a chapter book to a group of younger children. His mother later told me that the camp had transformed his relationship with reading, turning a subject he had struggled with into a source of confidence and joy. These success stories validated every decision I had made about the inheritance, confirming that my father's trust had been well placed and that his resources were creating exactly the kind of impact he had envisioned. My family's reaction to the foundation's success was mixed. My mother attended the launch ceremony but sat in the back row and left without speaking to me directly. Ryan made no public comment about the foundation, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he continued to express bewilderment about my decision to give away what he considered rightfully his. Ashley made one final attempt at reconciliation in August, calling to invite me to Tyler's 9th birthday party and suggesting that family relationships were more important than whatever disagreements we might have about money. "Emma, the children miss you," she said, her voice carrying the kind of emotional manipulation that I had learned to recognize and resist. "Tyler keeps asking why Aunt Emma doesn't come to family gatherings anymore." "Tyler is welcome to visit me any time," I replied. "But I'm not interested in pretending that nothing has changed when everything has changed. What would it take for you to forgive us? What would we need to do to repair this relationship?" The question surprised me with its directness, though I suspected it was motivated more by continued hope for financial benefit than genuine desire for reconciliation. "You would need to acknowledge that my choices were valid," I said, after considering her question carefully. "You would need to admit that measuring my worth by Ryan's standards was unfair and hurtful. You would need to respect the person I am instead of pressuring me to become someone else." "That seems reasonable," Ashley said quickly, too quickly for the words to carry much weight. "And you would need to mean it," I added. "Not just say it because you think it's what I want to hear, but actually believe it and demonstrate that belief through your actions over time." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about the likelihood of genuine family reconciliation. They wanted forgiveness without accountability, relationship without respect, access without acceptance. Fall arrived with the familiar rhythm of a new school year, my 3rd-grade classroom filled with eager faces and endless possibilities. But this year felt different in fundamental ways that had nothing to do with curriculum changes or class size fluctuations. I was teaching from a place of complete choice rather than economic necessity, bringing an energy and enthusiasm that came from knowing I was exactly where I belonged. The foundation had grown throughout its first year, attracting donations from community members who wanted to support our mission and attention from state education officials who were studying our model for potential replication in other districts. I had hired a part-time administrator to handle the growing paperwork demands, allowing me to focus on program development and direct service while maintaining my teaching responsibilities. One October afternoon, as I was helping a struggling reader sound out complicated words, I realized that I had achieved something I had never consciously pursued. I had become exactly the person my father had hoped I would become. Not wealthy in the way my family measured wealth, but rich in purpose and impact. Not successful according to traditional metrics, but deeply fulfilled by work that mattered. The phone call that confirmed my father's ultimate vindication came in November, almost exactly 1 year after the inheritance revelation. Mr. Harrison called to inform me that Ryan was facing serious financial difficulties with his real estate business, having overextended himself on a development project that had fallen through when investors discovered irregularities in his financial projections. He's asked me to inquire whether you might be willing to provide a loan to help stabilize his business, Mr. Harrison said, his tone carefully neutral. And what did you tell him? I told him that I would convey his request, but that your financial commitments to the foundation and your educational mission would likely preclude any business investments. The irony was perfect and complete. Ryan, who had built his identity around financial success and had dismissed my career as evidence of limited ambition, was now asking for help from the sister he had called the family disappointment. The brother who had measured worth by net worth was discovering that his own financial foundation had been built on sand. Please tell Ryan that I wish him well, I said, meaning it sincerely despite everything that had passed between us. But tell him that my money is committed to helping children reach their potential, not bailing out adults who made poor business decisions. That evening, I sat in my small apartment above the bakery, grading papers by lamplight and listening to the quiet sounds of Cedar Falls settling into another peaceful night. My life looked almost exactly the same from the outside as it had 2 years earlier, but everything essential had changed. I was no longer the family member who apologized for her choices or justified her values. I was a woman who understood her worth and used her resources accordingly. The final validation came in December, when the state education department invited me to speak at their annual conference about innovative funding models for public education. Standing at the podium in front of 300 educators from across Ohio, I talked about the Collins Educational Foundation and the difference that targeted private funding could make in expanding opportunities for children. The question isn't whether we can afford to invest in education, I concluded. The question is whether we can afford not to. Every child who doesn't reach their potential because of inadequate resources is a loss for all of us. Every barrier we remove, every opportunity we create, every life we help transform, makes our entire community stronger. The standing ovation that followed felt like my father's final gift to me, confirmation that his trust had been placed in someone who would honor his values and expand his impact far beyond what he could have achieved alone. As I drove home to Cedar Falls that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me from family disappointment to community leader, from struggling teacher to educational philanthropist. The inheritance had given me financial security, but more importantly, it had given me the confidence to be completely and unapologetically myself. I was no longer Emma Collins, the spinster teacher who lived above a bakery and disappointed her family with her modest ambitions. I was Emma Collins, educator and advocate, a woman who had transformed her father's legacy into opportunities for hundreds of children who deserved every chance to discover their own potential. The money would continue to create scholarships and fund programs long after I was gone, ensuring that my father's values would live on through generations of children who might never know his name, but would benefit from his belief that education was the key to unlocking human possibility. I had found my purpose, honored my father's memory, and created something meaningful from resources that could have been wasted on luxury and status. The family disappointment had become the family's greatest success story, though they might never understand the metrics by which that success should be measured. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.